Vila stood tall on the command deck of her cruiser, her arms crossed as she looked down through the glass panels at the earthborn creature chained and silent in the holding chamber below. Her posture was calm, but her eyes carried the cold gaze of one who believed herself to be far above the thing she was escorting. She had been raised to see humans as wild, emotional, and weak-minded beings. Fragile bodies with overactive hearts and no discipline, barely able to grasp basic interstellar understanding. Her people had once come across Earth and considered it unworthy of true contact. Now this one sat below her, silent, stubborn, and calm. The human's name was Mark. Vila hadn't bothered to learn more than that. He had been captured on the outskirts of the Vega system, supposedly interfering with a military supply route. He hadn't resisted arrest, hadn't fought back, and hadn't spoken more than a few sentences since the journey began. That quiet irritated her more than if he had shouted insults or begged for mercy. Silence from a human felt unnatural. It felt like defiance, quiet and calculated. She walked into the chamber where Mark sat on the cold metallic bench, his hands loosely bound in energy cuffs. He looked up as the doors slid open, but made no move. Vila stepped closer, her voice sharp and mocking as she said that she didn't understand why humans still tried to pretend they were equal in this galaxy. She told him that her people ruled hundreds of systems, while his kind barely escaped their own moon a century ago. She laughed when she said that he must have thought surrender would gain him mercy. Mark said nothing, he just stared. Calm and unmoved. Vila leaned closer, trying to get a reaction. She told him about the last human she had transported, how easily that one cried when threatened with memory extraction. She asked him if he would cry too, but Mark didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Just then the ship shook slightly as a sudden wave of spatial turbulence hit. The lights flickered and Vila braced herself against the wall. Mark fell from the bench but caught himself with ease. His shirt tore slightly on the back where it caught on a metal corner. Vila stood straight again and waved off the ship AI, saying everything was under control. But when she turned back to Mark, her eyes caught something strange. A scar. No, not just a scar, something more. It was shaped in a clean, sharp-edged design burned into the skin just beneath his shoulder blade. It wasn't random or messy like most scars from war. It was exact, almost elegant. A spiral with inward lines, shaped like a seal or emblem. Something about it pulled at her memory. She narrowed her eyes and stepped closer. Mark shifted slightly, but did not cover it. Vila stared at the mark and felt a strange shiver crawl down her neck. She knew she had seen that symbol before, but couldn't place where or when. It wasn't from human military records or Earth-based languages. It was older. Without thinking, she opened her wrist display and scanned the mark. The system paused longer than usual. Then it flashed a warning. Symbol classification unknown. Potential match with archive record. Protocol Omega clearance. Denied. Her brow furrowed. Protocol Omega was the highest level of archival secrecy. Even fleet commanders weren't allowed to access those files. Only the Council or Prime Historian could unlock such data. Why would a human carry a symbol locked behind a protocol even? She couldn't view. She turned her gaze back to him, now less confident than before. He was still calm. Almost too calm. Where did you get that mark? She asked. Her voice wasn't sharp this time. It was lower, almost quiet. Mark tilted his head and finally spoke. You don't even know what it means. These words hit her with more force than any weapon. There was no fear in his voice, no anger. Just a calm certainty that unsettled her in ways she didn't understand. She stared for another moment before backing away. The door closed behind her as she walked out of the chamber, her mind now swirling with a discomfort she couldn't shake. She returned to the bridge and ordered the AI to trace any visual records of the symbol. The system denied the request. She tried 3 more ways, bypassing minor levels of clearance, but the same restriction returned each time. She wasn't sure if she was angry or afraid. She paced the floor slowly, remembering something her grandfather once said when she was a child. He told her that long ago, before their people learned how to travel between stars, before they built fleets and forged empires, they encountered a flame they couldn't control. He said it burned so hot they tried to erase it from memory, to bury it beneath layers of time. She had always thought it was just a story, a fable told to frighten young minds into discipline. But now she wasn't so sure. That mark wasn't random. That silence wasn't weakness. She looked through the glass. Again. Mark sat there, unbothered, as if he knew everything already. And for the first time since she had taken command of the mission, Vila began to feel something she had never felt toward a human before. Vila sat alone in her private quarters, the walls humming faintly with the quiet rhythm of the cruiser moving through deep space. She should have been reviewing protocols for arrival at the tribunal, preparing her speech for the council, confirming delivery details of the prisoner. But none of those tasks held her attention. Her thoughts returned again and again to the strange mark burned into the human's back, the shape precise and unnerving, the scar glowing faintly under the skin like a thing not completely healed but also not new. It was as if the symbol had never been placed there by force, but by something deeper, maybe older, maybe meant to be there since birth. The restricted file had only deepened her discomfort. Protocol Omega was not something officers joked about. It was a shadow in their training, something mentioned only once in academic halls and never questioned, a level of secrecy meant for things not to be discussed. But that mark was tied to it, locked behind the highest level of data vault. How could a human, a simple Earthborn outsider from a backwater species, carry something the system treated as sacred or dangerous enough to hide? She called up the ship's visual memory and ran the footage again, slowing the frames as Mark's shirt tore and the mark became visible. She paused on the clearest shot, the lighting catching every carved edge of the symbol. Her fingers hovered over the screen as if touching the image might make it reveal its truth. The design was not random. It had symmetry, logic, even language. A spiral of energy wrapped around a core, surrounded by 7 marks resembling teeth or flames. The central point looked like a star compressed into a cage. It was not decorative. It was meant to mean something powerful. She left her quarters and returned to the command deck, where only a junior officer monitored the ship's systems. Vela dismissed him with a short wave, taking control herself. She tapped into the nav data core and opened a local scan of active relic frequencies. Normally this tool was used to detect fragments of pre-galactic tech or echoes from ancient ruins. She wasn't sure why she did it now, but her instincts pushed her forward. The scan hummed and pulsed as it reached through layers of space, reading subtle patterns of energy flow. After a few minutes, the screen flashed with a single weak signal matching the same frequency shape as the scar. The echo wasn't coming from outside the ship. It was coming from inside the holding chamber. Vila narrowed her eyes. That shouldn't have been possible. Humans didn't carry relic energy. It was considered a lost force, something that only appeared around forgotten worlds and collapsed stars. And yet here it was, pulsing faintly from Mark's location. She opened the chamber door again, stepping inside without announcing herself. Mark looked up, still sitting in the same position. Calm as before, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked slowly around him, staring at the scar, her eyes fixed and searching. It wasn't glowing now, but something inside it felt alive, as if the skin remembered a time when it burned with purpose. She asked him how he got it. Her voice wasn't filled with mockery now. It held weight, quiet and careful, like someone speaking to a force they didn't fully understand. Mark didn't answer right away. He glanced at her, studying her face the way someone might examine a piece of glass for cracks. Then he said it came from before he was born. It was not carved by hands, not given by ceremony. It was awakened. Vila frowned. Awakened from what? Mark said it had been dormant in his bloodline for generations, hidden by time, waiting for a sign that the galaxy had forgotten what mattered. His voice was still soft, but it carried something strange, like memory and judgment wrapped together. He said the scar only reveals itself when one's presence is needed again. When the stars grow too proud and when the old arrogance begins to rise, the ones with the mark are drawn forward. Vila stepped back, a chill forming along her arms. She asked what the mark meant, not just the shape, but the truth behind it. Mark tilted his head slowly, then told her it was a sign of fire given and fire denied. That long ago, the galaxy had been offered wisdom, peace, and shared strength, but chose instead to control, conquer, and erase. The mark belonged to those who once gave light but were cast out when they refused to kneel. Vela stared at him, unsure if she was listening to myth or warning. Her training screamed that this was madness, that humans were not builders of the past, only children stumbling through space. But her heart beat faster as her mind fought with memory. Somewhere deep in her own blood, a shape moved in the dark. Corners of thought. Something forgotten, a dream from childhood she never spoke aloud. A dream of fire and wings and a voice that said, "Remember who you are." She shook the feeling off and told Mark that even if what he said was true, it didn't explain why he allowed himself to be captured or why he didn't fight. Mark replied that he was never captured. He simply walked where he was needed. He said the trial was not his, it was hers. Vila froze. Her eyes narrowed. Hers? What did that mean? Mark said her people had erased too much. They had covered their history with glory and medals and stars, but the past did not die. It only slept. He said the scar on his back was not a threat, but a message, one her blood could read if she stopped lying to herself. She turned without another word and walked out, her steps fast and her thoughts louder than ever. She didn't return to the bridge. Instead, she went to the old archives room, rarely used on ships anymore. She searched the sealed cultural memory banks, forcing her access through older codes left by long-dead captains. She didn't even know why she still remembered those codes. They were told as stories in academy halls, not meant for real use. She searched for the emblem. After several failed scans, one hidden log appeared, without title, only marked as forgotten truth. The file opened slowly, shaky with age. Inside was an image. Not of Mark, not of Earth, but of a temple of flame, carved into black stone, surrounded by stars. And at its center stood a figure with the same mark on its back and standing beside. That figure in the old memory was a woman. She looked almost exactly like Vila, sat in silence long after the old memory faded from the screen. The image of the Blackstone temple still burned behind her eyes, that glowing mark, that figure standing tall, and the woman beside him whose face mirrored hers in a way that was impossible to ignore. She told herself it had to be a coincidence, a glitch in the records, a digital artifact that just happened to resemble her features. But even as the excuses came to her mind, her hands trembled and her throat felt tight. She had seen her face in that memory, not a similar one, not a random match. It had been her or someone made in her exact image, standing beside the marked figure in what looked like a forgotten time long before any modern records existed. She leaned back against the wall of the archive room and stared up at the ceiling, as if answers might come from above. The silence around her felt heavy. Not just the silence of the ship, but a deeper one. The kind of silence that came when something hidden for generations started to rise again. She wondered what her ancestors had known and why they had buried it so deeply that even their own descendants had no memory of the truth. Her fingers moved slowly as she copied the memory file into her private storage, locking it behind encryption. Even she had rarely used. She didn't want the ship's AI to flag it. She didn't want command to know what she had seen. Not yet. Not until she understood what this truly meant. She stood up and made her way back through the narrow corridors. Her steps slower now, the usual sharpness in her stride dulled by uncertainty. Her crew noticed her change in mood but said nothing. No one dared to question her directly. She reached the holding chamber again and paused in front of the door, her hand resting on the panel. Her thoughts swirled with too many questions. Who? Was this human really? What did he know? Why did he speak as if time had no meaning and history was still being written in secret? She stepped inside. Mark was standing this time. His hands no longer bound, though. No one had released him. The cuffs had deactivated during her absence. That was impossible under normal security, yet here he stood as if the rules of the ship no longer applied. He looked at her with calm eyes that no longer seemed human in the way she had once thought. She walked toward him, stopping a few paces away. She said she had seen the image. She told him about the memory file, the black stone, the mark, the woman who looked like her. She demanded to know what it meant. Mark nodded slowly and said that she had found the first piece of the truth. He said the galaxy had forgotten not because of time, but because of choice. Her people had chosen to forget. They had chosen to bury what they could not control. He told her that long ago the stars were united by a covenant of balance, forged by a race known only as the Keepers of Flame. They were not conquerors. They were not rulers. They were watchers and guides who offered knowledge freely but demanded one price: humility. When the stars grew arrogant, when empires rose and called themselves gods, the keepers vanished from the stars and left behind only a few signs. She asked if humans were those keepers. Mark smiled faintly and said not all. Humans, but some. He said Earth was not the birthplace but the last refuge, chosen for its isolation, hidden behind dust and silence until the time returned. He said the mark was not a symbol of power but of burden. It was not granted to those who sought it but revealed to those who were needed. Vila tried to hold on to the structure of her training, the logic of her command, the history she had always believed. But cracks were forming in her understanding like glass under heat. She asked why he was here now. Why show himself after so long? Mark replied that the balance had tipped again. He said her people had reached too far, silenced too many voices, erased too many truths. He said the tribunal was not for him but for her. That her blood held the echo of the keepers just as his did. That she too was part of a story her kind had tried to forget. She stepped back, breathing harder now. She looked down at her arm and thought about the strange dreams she had as a child. Dreams of light and fire and voices in a language she never understood. She remembered waking up once with a burning sensation on her shoulder. But when she looked, there was nothing, just skin, smooth and untouched. Until now she reached up slowly and pulled back her uniform sleeve. For a moment there was nothing. But then a faint line shimmered just beneath the skin. A shape began to form, not strong, not glowing, just barely visible. The same spiral, the same teeth of flame, the same mark. Her heart raced. She looked at Mark with wide eyes, unsure if she was terrified or reborn. He said the mark was awakening, because she was beginning to remember. He said her choices now mattered more than ever. That if she walked into the tribunal, pretending nothing had changed, the fire inside her would die, and her people would sink further into blindness. But if she chose to speak the truth, even at the cost of power, then the flame might rise again. She turned and left the chamber without a word. The mark still shimmered faintly on her arm. She didn't know what choice she would make yet. But she knew one thing for certain: everything she believed about weakness, about strength, about history and pride was no longer solid. The ground beneath her thoughts was shifting. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something far older than war, older than empires, something that might burn the galaxy clean or light the path forward. Stars outside the cruiser drifted slowly past the viewing glass. Soft streaks of light against the black as the ship moved through deep space. But inside the vessel, Vila's mind was no longer calm or ordered. The mark on her arm was no longer faint. Each hour it seemed clearer and stronger, pulsing gently, with a warmth that could not be explained by science or tech. She had wrapped her sleeve tightly, but it did little to hide the strange sensation, moving through her blood like a quiet call from a distant place she had never seen, but somehow always known. She could no longer tell whether she was afraid of what was happening, or finally beginning to feel awake after a lifetime of believing in a version of the galaxy built on half-truths. Vila stayed away from the holding chamber, not because she feared Mark, but because she feared herself. His presence brought answers but also more questions, and now those questions had become heavier than any duty. She sat at the edge of her private bunk, staring at the empty walls, trying to hold on to the discipline she had trained in for years, but nothing brought her peace. Her crew was still unaware of what was unfolding. The ship's systems operated as normal. There was no alarm, no obvious threat. Yet Vila felt as if something massive was about to happen. Then without warning, the ship lights flickered. The engine stuttered for a brief second. The I stammered in its voice relay before going silent. She rose to her feet and tapped the nearest console. But before she could issue a command, the proximity alert began to scream across the deck. She rushed to the bridge and dismissed the pilot crew with a single order. Alone on the command deck, she pulled up the nav scan and stared at the screen in disbelief. A fleet had arrived, not an enemy fleet. Not one marked by any known alliance. The ships did not resemble warships or trade carriers. Their designs were ancient and elegant, with long curved forms glowing softly in strange silver tones. There were no weapons drawn, no signal codes or hails, just presence. Silent and unmoving. Floating just at the edge of detection, like watchers rather than invaders. And on each of their surfaces a symbol glowed softly, the same spiral that now lived on her arm and Mark's back. She activated the outer speakers and tried to make contact. No reply. She asked for identity. Silence. She gave her ship's credentials. Still no answer. Then slowly, without threat, the fleet began to shift and form a ring around her vessel, as if protecting it from something invisible, or waiting for it to decide something before they would move again. She felt the mark on her arm burn a little stronger. It was not pain but intensity, a signal, a reaction. She understood now this was not random. They had not just found her ship by chance. This was part of the path Mark had walked onto willingly. This was what he meant when he said the tribunal was not for him but for her. She turned away from the screen and marched down the halls back toward the holding chamber. The doors slid open and she found Mark already standing near the entrance, as if he had known she would come. She demanded to know who the fleet belonged to. He told her they were not a fleet. They were not here to fight. They were sentinels. Fragments of what once was. Carriers of memory, not war. He said they responded to presence, not power. That her mark had signaled her awakening. They had come to witness what she would choose. She asked him what choice he kept speaking about. He said she must choose between comfort and truth. Between loyalty to a system built on forgotten lies, or a path back to something real, even if it meant stepping away from everything she had been taught to protect. Vila stared at him, and for the first time she noticed something behind his calm face. It was not pride. It was sorrow. A quiet burden he carried with every word he spoke. He had seen this moment many times before. Maybe not with her. Maybe not even in this galaxy. But the cycle repeated itself. The awakening always came with costs. Asked what would happen if she chose silence. If she let the fleet pass and delivered him to the tribunal, as if none of this had happened. He told her that silence would allow the stars to continue their sleep. But the fire within her would dim and never return. That mark on her skin would fade but leave behind emptiness. And the galaxy would fall deeper into the cold. She asked what would happen if she chose truth. He said it would be hard. She would be questioned, judged. She would lose rank, perhaps even face exile. But in time the stars might begin to remember. The fleet would remain. The old fire would rise. And others like her would begin to feel the marks hidden in their blood come alive again. She stood in the chamber with silence between them. Outside, the Sentinel fleet glowed like a sea of waiting stars. Her ship floated at the center of something ancient and silent and full of meaning. And for the first time Vila spoke not as a commander or officer, but as someone seeking to see clearly. She said she wanted to remember. Mark smiled and said then it had already begun. She walked to the central console and opened a secure channel, not to the tribunal, but to every free transmission line in the outer systems. Her voice clear and steady, she spoke of forgotten symbols and quiet visitors of memory, buried in skin and flame not extinguished. She did not give names. She did not offer orders. She offered a question. What if the story they all believed was not the full truth? The message was sent. Her ship no longer just a carrier of a prisoner, but a signal across the stars and far away. Across systems unseen, other marks began to glow faintly on arms, backs, shoulders, chests. People who never knew they carried fire, people who were beginning to wake up. The message traveled faster than any ship ever could, bouncing between forgotten satellites and drifting relay stations, echoing across broken networks and abandoned channels that no one had touched for generations. And yet someone had been listening. Somewhere deep in the core systems, an old archive flared to life, one that had not seen power in ages. Its screens lit up, its scanners awakened, and its ancient voice whispered one word. Through dark halls, return. Vila stood at the center of her command deck. The stars outside no longer felt like distant lights, but like watchers waiting for her next move. The fleet of ancient vessels still surrounded her ship, but now they began to hum faintly, their bodies responding to the signal she had sent like living things stirred from long sleep. The air around her felt different, charged, filled with something she could not name but could feel in every breath. Her crew started asking questions. Officers reported strange readings. Energy levels rising from nowhere, soft pulses moving through the ship like heartbeats. One by one, they noticed the mark on her arm, now fully visible, glowing gently under her skin like fire remembered. Whispers spread through the corridors, but no one dared challenge her. Some stared with fear, others with wonder. She did not explain, not yet. The time for answers was still coming. Mark stood beside her, now no longer a prisoner, no longer an outsider. His presence did not command authority, but something else, something older. Wherever he walked, silence followed, but not the silence of fear, rather the silence of respect. He told her that more signals were rising from other places, from other people who carried pieces of the old fire without even knowing it. The awakening was beginning, but what came next depended on those who held the fire now. She asked him what their purpose had truly been all those ages ago, when the keepers had walked among the stars, when temples stood on worlds, now dust, when fire was not just heat but meaning. Mark said they were never meant to rule or destroy. They were not chosen by strength or by mind, but by spirit. They had been guides, not gods, and their only task was to remind the stars that light came with balance, and power without memory led only to ruin. But pride had broken the covenant. Empires rose with machines and weapons and numbers, but no wisdom. So the fire faded, not because it was defeated, but because it was hidden, waiting for time to circle back, and now it had. Vila looked at her hands. the mark burning like truth across her skin, and she saw now that everything she had once believed about her strength, about her training, about what made her superior had been false. Real strength was not force. Real power was not control. The fire within her came not from command but from choice. Her people had chosen silence before. Now she would not dot. As the cruiser approached the space near the tribunal world, her screens lit up with incoming transmissions. Officials demanded answers. Why had she left protocol? Why had she opened forbidden files? Why was there a relic fleet following her? They accused her of corruption, of betrayal. They told her to stand down. But she did not reply. She stood at the center of the bridge with Mark behind her and simply let the silence speak louder than orders. Then the fleet moved. The ancient ships formed a path around her vessel, guiding it gently like hands through stars. The tribunal fleets, watching from afar, did not interfere. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they were uncertain. But they did not stop her. She descended not to the tribunal halls, but to the old surface of the planet below, where ruins had once been a temple where the fire had burned long ago. Before anyone called themselves rulers, she stepped down from her ship alone, though she knew others watched from distant eyes. The ground beneath her felt warm, as if the stone remembered her steps. At the center of the ruins, she placed her hand on the cold, dark surface, and the mark on her skin flared to life, sending a ripple of golden light through the ruins, awakening machines and lights and voices that had slept for eons. Above in the sky, the sentinel fleet began to glow brighter, forming a signal seen across the stars, a symbol not of war, but of return. And in systems far away, in homes of stone and steel, people stopped and looked at their skin, where faint lines began to appear like old stories finding their way back. Some fell to their knees in awe, others ran in fear. But all of them felt Ida. Memory not theirs, but known, a voice without words, but full of purpose. And Vela stood at the center of it all, not as a soldier, not as a commander, not as a proud daughter of a conquering species, but as a reminder. She had mocked the human for his silence, for his patience, for the strange calm in his eyes, but now she understood. Had never been weak, he had simply remembered before she did. And now, as the fire lit the stars once more, as the old truth began to rise from under layers of broken history, Vela felt no fear. The galaxy would not change in a moment, but it had begun. She looked toward the sky where the spiral burned bright against the black, and she whispered a word her people had not spoken in 1,000 years. Awaken. And the stars listened. The end.